Jack Poe, Jackpoe.
And you were a retired chaplain.
I'm retired chaplain, Oklahoma City Police Department, 28 years.
You were here for 28 years.
28 years. We worked the Oklahoma City bombing, and that was the reason they wanted us to come to New York to help them.
And it took a little bit to get you there. So once you got notice that you were wanted in New York for September 11th to help in the aftermath, tell us that story.
Well,
about the Angel Flight.
they wanted some chaplains up there to talk to their people. They wanted somebody that had experienced such a tragic event as we had. Asked if we could send some chaplains up, and so the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma paid for 5 of us to go up. We left on Thursday. There's not any planes flying. They made our flight an Angel flight, and they couldn't get all of us, but they got 3 of us in this plane and flew us to New York City, and we got there about noon Friday.
And an Angel Flights, for folks that don't know, what is that exactly?
An Angel flight is a flight where they transport organs, blood, across the country for people who's needing it for an operation or a transplant.
So once you get there, what do they do with you? I mean, it had to be, I think you explained to me a little bit earlier, you guys got off the plane and people are like, who are these guys?
Yeah.
You know, because the airspace was shut down.
Yeah, the airspace is shut down, so even when we stopped the first night to refuel, people was wondering what we were flying for. Kind of explained to them, and it was okay, and they refueled us so we could finally make the trip. But when we got there, it's still smoking. It smoked forever, if you remember. You having been there before, knew where the towers were, and you couldn't believe they weren't there. We talked to people in New York. I'll never forget, they said, we use those towers for a guide. We could be somewhere in downtown New York, and we could look up at the towers, and we knew which direction, how we should go. And she says, now we're lost, because we look up and there's no towers.
What kind of work did you, I mean, you said they had a couple of makeshift morgues. What work did you do once you got there?
We didn't know what we were going to do when we got there. So we did what we were supposed to do. We went to a command post and we asked them if they would get a hold of the chaplains to let them know, police chaplains, that we're here from Oklahoma City, and they'd ask us to help, and could you help us get credentials? You know, where do we start? So we probably waited about 2 hours, never got a word back. And finally this captain came out and he said, y'all look tired, you need to take a nap. Of course, I'm not very smart, and I said, oh, we're okay. He said, look at me, you're tired and you need to take a nap, and there's beds in there, and y'all go in there and take a nap. So he let us in. And we went over to where the beds were, and he said, I know who you are. You're on your own. And that's initially how we got onto the grounds. And we made our way somehow over to one of the temporary morgues outside the Merrill Lynch building. And a good friend of mine now, wasn't then, worked for Merrill Lynch in the HR department. And he looked, I had a helmet on from Oklahoma City, said chaplain. He said, you a chaplain? And we said, yeah, we're chaplains. He said, I need your help. Come with me. So he took us over to the temporary morgue, and he said, we need some help here. And introduced us to the people working the morgue. And these people need some encouragement. Okay. So the first 4 days we worked that morgue outside of the Memorial Lynch building until the federal people came in with better equipment and more doctors to help try to identify bodies. But we were real surprised. Any time they brought part of a body in, or sometimes just a bucket of charred bones, the people who worked in the medical examiner's office, wouldn't touch them until we prayed over them. Now, we were from Oklahoma kind of surprised, but those people, those were very precious people, and they weren't going to touch them until we prayed for who that person might be and for that family, and then they started doing the work that they do. And but the other thing that really, besides doing that with the medical examiners, we had officers, we had firemen and officers who would come to the morgue and see if we had any information on their loved ones, because it's not unusual for families in New York, both on the fire and the police side, to have multitude of families working for the fire, for the police. And it was hard to say to them, we don't see a list here, and they'd come back maybe 3 times while they're down there trying to see if we recovered anything of their loved ones. Now it's amazing. You know how big fire trucks are. They're pretty big. And I was sitting on the side one evening and visiting with an officer, and I just kind of looked up and it caught my eye. There's a fire truck, and it had been smashed no bigger than that cabinet. A fire truck. You know, I would think if there's a fire truck there and I can get under that fire truck, as heavy as that fire truck is, I might have a chance. That's how much weight came down. And that was amazing. But people were not giving up hope. And yet, as of course the days went on, hope grew less. And you could feel the pain and the hurt and disbelief that this would have happened in America, that people would hate us so much that they would take innocent lives to prove a point.
You go to the morgue. When was the first day you actually went to the actual site and looked up?
Well, when we got on the site, at least the first night we were on site, and I went around the Memorial Lynch building and on around to the back in the area, and you could look out there and there were, spotlights shining down. They're working day or night, and I just kind of spoke out loud to myself. I said, this looks like a Hollywood scene, and this officer said, but it's for real. You couldn't believe it. Again, when we were there in the very process, the very beginning process of trying to remove debris and trying to see if they could find anyone. I noticed that the fire union steel workers brought them in because that steel has been, with all the fire, it's if they didn't know what they were doing with that steel, they could cut part of that steel and it could come loose and kill other people. So, man, I was amazed to see those iron workers. A lot of them young kids, And man, it's just like a knife, a surgeon's knife, you know. They knew exactly where to cut and how to cut. And then, of course, they would haul all that off, but you know, it was we felt like all the chaplains felt like we made a difference in those first 14 days. I remember one of these experiences. There was a ship in the Hudson River where they went for a cruise and served meals and then come back, and of course nothing's operating. And so the person that the ship was docked started fixing meals for the rescue workers. And so other places were doing the same around the perimeter, but we were down by the world, so we'd go down there and grab a bite to eat every now and then. So one evening, I'm headed down there, about, I'm saying, lunch, maybe sometime around lunch. And this captain from the Port Authority stopped me. He said, "You're a chaplain." I said, "Yes." He said, "You're from Oklahoma City?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I need your help." Said, "Tonight we're going to dedicate posters of the officers from New York City and the Port Authority and the names of the fire department people. And we're going to do it here, where I'm at." He said, "This is the memorial for the New York City police officer killed in the line of duty." He said to me, "This morning I discovered it. I didn't know it was here. And it's covered in all this stuff from the building." And he called his people over, and they took 5-gallon buckets down to the Hudson River. They filled those buckets up. His men came back, and they cleaned that memorial. And he says, "Tonight we're going to bless these pictures. And I want you to find me a Catholic priest who'll bless them, and somebody to pray, and I want you to speak." I'm thinking, okay. So I remember I went down and got a little bite to eat, and I started writing something down. You know what are you going to say? And started putting something together, and I got through eating, and I came back and then went into where the memorial was. I hadn't seen it. I didn't know it was there. And I remember there was an officer there from New York City, and he was putting his finger on names, and he'd say, "This was my friend, called his name, killed in the line of duty. Here's another friend of mine, killed in the line of duty." I don't know, 3 or 4 names he picked out. And then he kind of went across the bottom and across the bottom. He said, this is how much space it's going to take to put these other names in. Well, they put up a tent, and they brought these posters in and put up a tent, covered the memorial, most of it, and I got a Catholic priest, and I went down, and the other chaplain went down from Oklahoma City with me to close the prayer, and then it started raining. So number one, it's a good thing they had a tent up, or those pictures would not have made it. But it was all covered under the tent, and we started, to speak. And he said, "We got to wait a minute. We're waiting on a captain from New York Police Department to come, and it's raining." And I'm thinking, these guys are not going to stand out in this rain much longer. But they weren't leaving. So the captain finally came in, and we blessed, and I spoke. Well, after I spoke, the Baptist Strong Convention of Oklahoma wanted a copy. So we sent them a copy, and they printed it in their next edition of the Baptist Messenger. So I'm going to say a couple of years later, I got a call from Holman Press. They were going to produce a police officer's Bible. They said, could you send us a couple of things to look at? So Phyllis and I sent them 2 articles that we wrote and that memorial service. So the memorial service is in the front page of the back of the Bible, where there are different articles in the back. So that was the first memorial service done on 9/11 at the place where they honored New York City police officers killed in the line of duty. The first memorial service.
When you think about everything that you saw in those 2 weeks, to be a part of that,
Oh yeah,
to be just one of just a handful of chaplains that they called from Oklahoma.
yeah.
How did that make you feel? How do you think about what you were able to do, the people that you met?
Well, the first thing I thought about is how God's in charge, and God put us in a position where we needed to be at the right moment. I mean, there were thousands. There were quite a few chaplains from all over the country down there. Anybody could have walked by at that moment, but I just happened to walk by. And so one of the things that would happen is they would see that we were from Oklahoma, and they'd talk to us. They might not talk to anybody else, but they'd talk to us because you've been there. You've been there. How are your people doing? How are you doing? And we'd say, how are you doing? And so it opened a lot of conversations that we probably wouldn't have had we not been chaplains from Oklahoma City down at Ground Zero.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And I imagine you've kept in touch with some of these folks.
We have kept in touch with them. The Leo Flanagan, who was with the AR of Merrill Lynch, we have been to his home on many occasions. He's been to Oklahoma City on many occasions. He spoke at one of our Baptist churches at 9/11 one year. They invited us back, and we did vows for he and his wife on one of their anniversaries. So we'll stay in contact. I will give him a call on the 11th. There's a couple I'll call on the 11th, see how they're doing. And on April the 19th, I'll get several calls from people in New York calling to see how we're doing. So we'd have never had a chance to have developed those relationships had there not been a tragedy that brought us together.
I think it's unique that Oklahoma City had our tragedy, and the people in New York, such a big city, had such a huge event that happened there. But to some degree, they took solace in knowing that someone else was there that experienced on some level what they were going
Well,
through.
and for us to make that poster that all our people sign and take to give them at New York, and to know, we knew it was bad. The gentleman that paid for the flight and the plane said that his wife called him and said, there's a nursery in Hoboken. Hoboken is right across the Hudson River in New Jersey. Said there's a nursery over there where the kids didn't have a parent to pick them up. Both parents worked in the financial district. Both parents perished. Those kids. That's pretty bad.
Was there ever a time where you felt overwhelmed at all? I know as a chaplain, a lot
Well,
of people come to you with their problems.
Oh, I tell you, no. There were, I can't tell you, there were many times we asked the Lord to give us strength, to we put in some long hours, but to give us the words, the wisdom and the words to say to people who were hurting. Because we were speaking for him, hopefully not necessarily from us, but give us the hope and wisdom that we're making a difference. And as I said, there's no doubt that we did. You know, it's real interesting. We were down at Ground Zero, and we're in. Told you that he got us in, and we're figuring out how do we get credentials. So the first credentials that we got was I met one of the officers there, and I brought some pins from Oklahoma City. That it's the state of Oklahoma, and in the middle of it is the survivor's tree, little pins about that size, and it's April 19, 1995. And I can't tell you even where I found them, but I had a handful of them. So I took it down and I ran into Lloyd, and I said, can you help us to, how do we get credential? Oh, he said, I can take care of that. So he took us over to this, it's not a trailer where people who made credentials worked, and he got us the early credentials. So we got through. I reached in my pocket and gave him a pen. So this state of Oklahoma and we talked about the survivor's tree and how important that was to us. And he said, I'll wear that. So, okay. Now, on Sunday, I guess the second Sunday we were there, they had a big rally at Yankee Stadium. And there was 30,000 people. There was a bunch of people. It was filled. And they had different speakers from different faith groups there. And we went to the 6th precinct and was visiting with them, and they invited us to go with them down to Yankee Stadium. So we go to Yankee Stadium, and I go down, really, we got down on the very front row on about third base. I mean, we got some good seats. So we're sitting there, and I heard somebody behind me said, Jack. Well, we're there. Who, you know? Well, I turned around. It's Lloyd. He and his wife and his son sitting behind us. Come here. I want you to meet my wife. I want you to meet my son. So we went down there and met them, and he talked about the pen, and that's one of the people we still stay in contact with, you know. But just something that we could take and give to represent who we were and how important the survivor's tree was, and we had to make a choice. When we go through a traumatic event, we can become a victim or we can become a survivor. We make that choice. Victims focus on what they can't change, and survivors focus on what they can change. And so with the survivors tree, we said, let's focus on what we can change. Not on the negative, but on the positive, and let's make a difference. And that and the love for America. One of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to take an American flag with me to New York. But we didn't have a chance because, I mean, this flight came quickly. Like, we heard about it like in the morning, and by noon we were on a plane headed to New York. So when we got to New York, we were talking to, one of our guys was talking to one of the police officers in New York, and said, because on the side of the Merrill Lynch building, if you see those pictures down there, there was a large American flag flying. You could see it as you did recovery work. You couldn't get your eyes off that flag. And we kind of said to him, you know, we were trying to get an American flag, and he said, you know, the same thing happened here. He said, the first chance I got, first kind of break I got, he said, I went to get an American flag. And he said, I went to this store, and he said, as I started in, there was a homeless man there, and he says, really, I try to help the homeless because most of the time they're Vietnam people. And he said, all I had was a $20 bill. Wasn't going to give him a $20 bill. He said to me, I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Could you help me? He said, well, I'm going in to buy something. When I come out, I'll give you some money. Okay. Well, he goes in. The guy, he says, I need an American flag. The guy says, we don't have any. They went quickly. So he said, I came out, and I didn't have any change, and I went back to tell him they didn't have what I was looking for, and he said, I noticed that tucked inside his shirt was an American flag. And he said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He said, I'll give you $20 for that American flag. He said, the homeless man looked up at him and says, sir, as hungry as I am, this flag ain't for sale. He said, I took the $20 bill and I gave it to him, and I saluted Old Glory, and I went back to work. And I try to tell people the flag's not for sale. As Americans, I think we need to remember the flag's not for sale.